Over the Easter weekend of 2002, about 1,000 refugee solidarity protesters gathered at the Woomera detention centre in South Australia. In dramatic scenes, the fences were pushed down by refugees inside with the help of protesters outside, and about 40 refugees escaped in a huge embarrassment for John Howard's Liberal government. The action brought the government's cruelty to refugees and asylum seekers to the attention of millions around the country, and it showed, as we've seen over and over again over the past 20 years, that refugees are active fighters for their own freedom. It also gave a glimpse of how a determined, active campaign of solidarity could break through the government's veil of secrecy. And as we continue the fight for refugee freedom and permanent settlement today, the Woomera breakout continues to be an inspiration. Today is the latest in our new segment of The Sound of Solidarity entitled I Was There, where activists who have taken part in key struggles tell their story. I'm talking to Solidarity member James Supple, a long-term activist with the Refugee Action Coalition in Sydney. James was at Woomera over those dramatic days 20 years ago in 2002. You're listening to The Sound of Solidarity, brought to you by Solidarity. We're a revolutionary socialist group in Australia, and if you'd like to find out more about us, our website is solidarity.net.au. I'm David Glans, and I'm recording this episode on unceded Wurundjeri land in Naarm or Melbourne. So welcome, James.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
All right, well, first up, let's just go over the basics. Where is Woomera, and how did so many refugees end up there?
Woomera is a town about 500 kilometres north of Adelaide. The detention centre was built just outside the town, another couple of kilometres outside. Opened in November 1999. And, that was in a period where that year and the end of the year before, there had been a small increase in refugees arriving by boat in Australia. So the Liberal government opened that detention centre. It was built for about 400 people. But at its height, there was almost 1,500 people that were housed in that detention centre. And I think one of the obvious things about the location is just the remoteness. We're talking a place which is effectively in the middle of the desert in Australia, a very long way from anywhere. And that was a very deliberate move to put refugees in a remote, inaccessible location like that, where they were a long way away from supporters, from visitors, from lawyers and legal assistance of any kind. And it was a deliberate attempt to break people as well, putting them in that kind of location.
And nowadays refugees in detention have mobile phones, but that wasn't the case back in 2000, 2002.
That's right. And there was no internet. It was before the days where that was common as well. And I understand it, when Woomera was actually opened in 1999, there was literally one telephone for, the hundreds of asylum seekers that were kept there. It was difficult to access that. You needed phone cards to access the phone. So that really compounds the isolation, I think, and gives you an indication of, the wider kind of conditions that people were held in there.
Now, at that point at least, if the asylum seekers were found to be refugees, they had a chance of being able to stay in Australia, unlike the people who came by boat later on. But they were held for a very long time. What was the average processing time? Remembering, of course, that there were hundreds of children amongst those 1,400 detainees.
There was people there who took up to a year to process. Certainly most people were there for 8-9 months. And by the time of 2002, Woomera was also essentially being used as a place to dump people who had been initially rejected in terms of their refugee claims. So we're talking about people who were even longer term detainees who'd been processed, who'd been in the system for years at that point.
Now, we'll talk about the 2002 breakout in a moment, but that wasn't actually the first time that refugees had broken out. There were breakouts at Woomera and then Curtin and Port Hedland in WA. So what drove those breakouts?
Yeah, so the first major breakout was at Woomera actually in June of 2000, and about 400 or 500 asylum seekers that broke out. And on that occasion, it was not so much an attempt to escape the authorities and immigration, if you like. It was an attempt to bring some attention to what was actually happening in detention and what was being done to asylum seekers. So the Woomera breakout was really one of the major events, I think, that did put a national spotlight on what the Howard Liberal government was doing to refugees. You had, these 400 or 500 asylum seekers marched into the town of Woomera, which was about 3 kilometres from the detention centre. And they're actually there for 3 days, defying the immigration authorities in an attempt to get media attention, which they did do because they were there for such an extended period. That same year and the months following, there were also, as you say, breakouts at Curtin and Port Hedland in WA, which were two of the other remote detention centres in Western Australia where refugees were being dumped at the time.
So coming back to the events of 20 years ago in 2002, 1,000 activists converging in the desert, 500 kilometres from Adelaide, but thousands of kilometres from most of the other major cities, was quite a feat. How did the movement manage it?
It built on two kind of political developments in terms of social movements, if you like. In the years leading up to 2002, there'd been the growth of an anti-capitalist movement and series of demonstrations in Australia, which I think did help to establish the idea of protest convergences, like in particular the S11 protest in Melbourne outside the Crown Casino against the World Economic Forum in 2000, where activists converged from all over the country for that demonstration. Similarly, I think for the Chogam demonstration, people travelled from around the country to that in 2001. And, some of that spirit, I think, was taken into Woomera. Some of the activists who, helped to initiate the protest were No Borders, kind of no one is illegal activists who very much saw themselves as part of that, kind of global anti-capitalist movement. But, of course, there'd also been a, distinct refugee rights movement that had been growing in Australia since the middle of 2002. In fact, I think that initial Woomera breakout was one of the precipitating events in terms of a more organised refugee rights movement, developing in Australia, and the formation of some of the refugee action collectives that are still active today. In terms of how the movement organised it, what I remember from Melbourne, where I was at the time, is that Refugee Action Coalition helped to organise buses. Other activists got themselves there kind of on their own steam. And certainly in terms of Melbourne, it had actually been the second time that we had bussed to the Woomera Detention Centre. There'd been an earlier protest that RAC in Melbourne organised in September, I think late September 2001, where we'd been there for a shorter period. And I think there was that, there was a desire by a lot of activists and people who were supporters of refugees to try and get close to these remote kind of desert detention centres, because, as I say, it was an attempt to, put people out of sight, out of mind, out of, any contact with supporters, visitors and so on. And so there was a very strong, desire, I think, from people around the country to actually try and get close to some of these detention centres and to try and break down some of that isolation that the refugees kind of were experiencing. And I think some of the other background too in terms of the Woomera breakout is that there had been a lot of protest inside the detention centres as well by refugees already before 2002, particularly at the Woomera Detention Centre, driven by the isolation and the kind of appalling conditions. And you often had people in detention who had a background as political activists in their own countries who, fled places like Iraq with Saddam Hussein or Iran where there are repressive regimes. And, there was a lot of organising inside the detention centres in terms of, protests and hunger strikes, the breakouts and so on. And so I think there was a very strong desire, because people had seen those protests in detention centre, to try and, show some solidarity and link up with the people who were protesting inside detention.
So what was it like to be there? And tell us about the moment when the fences fell.
Well, this was a protest camp where we were essentially there for 3 days, I think, camping in the desert, with all the kind of organisation and logistics that kind of involved. We are talking about it like a camp in the middle of the desert, so you're talking about the red kind of centre, really, of Australia. In terms of the mobilisation itself, and when we got there, things really escalated quite quickly because we'd planned 3 days of different kinds of protests and actions at the detention centre, and no one quite knew what was going to be possible, what was going to happen. Like, we understood that a lot of the area around the detention centre was a restricted zone, and that the police were going to try and stop us getting really anywhere near the detention centre. We arrived on the Friday where the camp and the protest really kicked off. It was the first day of the convergence, and the convergence itself was organised and made decisions through big kind of all-in spokes council style meetings, and we really only had at the very first all-in meeting on the Friday afternoon, we're told, we got word that there'd been a call from inside the detention centres by some of the asylum seekers and refugees that they wanted to protest that afternoon, that they wanted to organise a solidarity protest, that they were going to be protesting inside, and they wanted us to try and march to to get somewhere near the detention centre and to hopefully be visible and to show solidarity with their protest that was happening inside. So, in response to that call, we tried to march towards the detention centre. Of course, the police tried to block the road, so people went off the main road, and we didn't really know where we were going. I don't know if there were people who had some clear idea or who had actually organised a way to get to the detention centre, but we pretty much went straight into the desert and came across a fence that we thought was one of the fences that was trying to stop us getting into the detention centre. And perhaps a dozen people, like, pretty much immediately, who were there to wanted to get as close to the refugees as possible, started to try and tear down that fence. So you had about a dozen people jumped up on the fence, trying to pull it back and forth, and actually wasn't it was actually quite quick that fence gave way and fell. And then there was a bit of a moment of hesitation where people, some people weren't sure about what to do, but quite a few hundred people streamed over that fence. Ironically, we found out later, if we'd gone a few 100 metres further, we could have actually walked around. It wasn't one of the main fences of the detention centre, but as we went a bit further, we got to the actual detention centre gates themselves, which were much more imposing than the fence that we'd just kind of come over. As soon as we got there were no police, so we could simply go right up to the outer fence of the detention centre, and could see some refugees already there who were calling out to us, who were part of the protest inside, and people were able to extend their hands and to shake hands with people inside the detention centre, and it was actually the asylum seekers themselves who managed to break open really the fence. You had the kind of a picket fence type of steel kind of fence on the outside of the detention centre, and there were asylum seekers inside who managed to really pry some of those steel pickets apart just large enough so that a person could get out through that outer fence. Within a short space of time, there was a stream of people who were through that fence kind of into the crowd before the police then managed to come up. But there were a number of asylum seekers streamed out, fell into the crowd, some of them, and then people were giving clothing to some of those asylum seekers so they could disguise themselves and blend in with the protest crowd. But a number of people broke out the front that way. But we also found out later, which I think is also a testament to the organisation inside the detention centre and the determination of the refugees to protest themselves, that the bulk of the people who actually escaped managed to get out the back of the detention centre, really using the protest where we were as a diversion, so that all the police and security concentrated on that area. From there, we had, there's a number of refugees who'd escaped from the detention centre, and we had to try and work out a way to spirit some of those people to safety and work out kind of what to do. So there was then quite a tense night, that night in particular, at the protest camp, where there was discussions about, with some of those refugees who'd escaped and amongst the protesters more generally, about how we were going to try and deal with that situation. it's true that some refugees were like fairly quickly kind of recaptured and put into detention, but there actually were, a number who escaped from immigration and for quite a number of years, like were free out in the community as a result of that, breakout from detention.
That's an amazing story. Now, detention in Woomera and the other remote camps came in the context of 9/11, the attack in the United States in 2001, and the whole following so-called war on terror. So what were the arguments activists faced at the time, and how did you respond?
Yeah, I think that context is very important because 2001 particularly was a very dramatic year, I think for Australian society, but also for the left and the refugee movement. And I think by the end of the year, I think a lot of people were reeling from shock as well as anger at what had happened in terms of that context. So as you said, in August you'd had the Tampa incident where Howard had sent the SAS onto the Tampa to stop refugees getting to Australia, and that was the beginning of the Pacific solution of sending people initially to Nauru, but later to Manus Island as well. And you had Labor's capitulation to Howard over the Tampa and over his anti-refugee Fortress Australia politics as well. At the time also supported, if opinion polls are correct, by about 70% of the population, and that was followed within a couple of weeks, actually just 2 weeks later, by 9/11 and the kind of dramatic and shocking attack on the Twin Towers. That was followed quickly by the US war in Afghanistan, and as a result of largely of some of those events, Howard also dramatically won an election that he was widely expected before this happened to win in November. So I think there was
he was expected to lose it, I think, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was. That's right. He was expected to lose the election, until the Tampa and 9/11. But then, in November, Howard won re-election, and I think as a result of that, there was quite a sense that there was a bit of a right-wing racist tide in society, and that the left and the refugee movement, refugee supporters were now quite isolated. But there was also a lot of anger at what had happened, and I think the refugee movement really grew significantly as well in the months kind of following, as people tried to work out kind of how to respond. But in terms of the arguments that all those events created and that we had to deal with, I mean, of course, Howard's sending refugees onto the Tampa and the broader efforts to construct detention centres and push anti-refugee policies meant that there was a whole series of racist myths that the Liberals and the mainstream media promoted that had to be dealt with. So even in 99, I think the Liberals had described the increase in boat arrivals as a national emergency. There was this idea that Australia was being flooded, that the government actually said that whole villages were packing up to come to Australia. And some of the the terms that we're now familiar with, like refugees being called illegals and criminals and so on, were popularised to try and drive home the Liberals' agenda. They introduced temporary protection visas as well in 1999 in terms of pushing the idea that refugees were queue jumpers and not coming through the proper channels and so on. So there was a whole lot of racist myths and myths about refugees like that the movement had to deal with. But I think there was also a broader issue about why the government was doing this in terms of the racist agenda the Liberals had, because if you look at the Howard government, for anyone who remembers, racism was really a feature of Howard's time in office all the way through from 1996. Initially you had all the events around the election of Pauline Hanson and the way that Howard responded to that in terms of saying that it was a good thing that people like Pauline Hanson could speak her mind, and really conceding to the anti-migrant ideas that she was pushing. You had his response to the stolen generation and refusing to apologise, and refugees was really the next target after that for the government. And I think it was quite stark, I think, with the become known as the Tampa election in 2001, where Howard won re-election, that racism that Howard was using played a really obvious role in turning people's anger, what was going on in society, away from the neoliberalism and the GST the Liberals had introduced and the anti-union laws and privatisation and so on that was really destroying working class people's lives, and turning that anger onto refugees, onto migrants, onto Indigenous people and so on. Because I think the 2001 election, it was stark the way that, as I said, that Howard had looked like he was going to lose the election because of the opposition that existed to the economic policies the Liberals were pushing that, were hurting working class people, and the way in which he was able to refocus political attention and make it out that refugees and, the number of people arriving here by boat was somehow, a national emergency, a problem that was somehow responsible for hurting people's living standards and, was going to somehow drive down wages and so on. So that use of racism as a way to, deflect people's attention and to make it easier to push through the pro-business kind of pro-capitalist economic agenda that the Liberals had, I think, was quite stark. But obviously not everyone saw it in those kind of terms, in terms of, a conscious way of actually trying to sow racism in the working class and use that as a way to, divide and rule in a sense. Yeah, so there was a lot of arguments about that, about how do you stand up to Howard, how did you actually build a movement around refugees and, I guess connect the solidarity and support for refugees and opposition to racism to, the wider kind of opposition to what the Liberals were doing and the broader kind of agenda the Liberals had.
You mentioned that many of the organisations of the refugee movement that are still around today were being formed at around this time. This was a critical moment really from 2001 onwards. How did the Woomera Convergence fit with that dynamic? Did the direct action and the challenge to the fences, did that encourage refugee supporters or did it put them off? Was there a big debate about whether it was the right way to go?
Yeah, there was certainly a debate. I mean, I think, you're right in the sense that Woomera was also a product of that kind of growth of the refugee movement at the end of, 2001. And, in a sense it was, like one kind of constituency taking up the issue in a way that there are other groups like Labour for Refugees and Chill Out or Rural Australians for Refugees who might have had different, strategies for supporting refugees and, for campaigning around the issue. There was certainly an issue and an argument before the Woomera protest that it was a mistake to go and protest at the detention centre, that the protest was itself going to be responsible for, perhaps a crackdown on refugees inside the detention centre and, for guards using it as an excuse to attack people inside the detention centre, to tear gas people, to make the conditions kind of even worse. Which I think was really tied to an idea that it was somehow, it was going to be dedicated legal work or private appeals to politicians or working through the right channels that, that was going to advance the cause of refugees. Whereas I think, our counter was firstly to say that there'd actually been a long process and, history already of refugees inside Woomera and other detention centres themselves, protesting. And in the lead up to the protest, there were hundreds of people in the detention centre signed an open letter supporting the protest and saying they wanted us to come as well. So the idea that it was simply the protesters outside were putting upon the refugees inside detention, I think wasn't accurate. Like there was a very real organisation and agency which refugees inside detention centres had and were using to protest against their conditions themselves, and quite a number of them did see what we were doing as, an act in solidarity with the organising and protest that they'd been doing inside detention. And I think importantly that both the protest by refugees inside detention centres and the protest outside actually did achieve things. Like it actually did, improve conditions inside the Woomera detention centre. I think, eventually, not that long after the protest, the Woomera detention centre itself was actually closed, which I think was part of the, government realising that Woomera itself had become kind of too much of a liability. And I think there's a broader sense too in which the the Woomera protest itself actually helped to expose what was going on in the Woomera detention centre, the conditions that people were held in, and I think shifted the wider political debate as well about refugees, so that a lot of people, I think, when they saw people protesting, being prepared to actually try and help refugees escape from detention, to break them out of the detention centre, led to a lot of questioning and discussion in broader society about why people were prepared to do that, what was going wrong in the detention centres, and why the government was pursuing this policy, which I think was part of the process of actually turning around public opinion and eventually forcing the government to make some concessions and changes in terms of releasing people from detention and a series of other things.
You mentioned the retreat of the Labour Party over Tampa, and then more broadly over refugee policy and indeed the war on terror. That was the Labour Party leadership, but actually within the Labour Party and within the unions, there was something of a groundswell of support for refugees and some really big debates. So how were they playing out at the time? And in asking that question, I'm assuming that it matters what the unions and the Labour Party membership think. Not everybody agrees with that. Why do you feel that winning union and ALP support was important?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that that issue about how to relate to the unions and the Labour Party was controversial through the refugee campaign, and perhaps still is. Now, having said that, like from the beginning of the campaign, really, particularly the RAC groups, did have a focus particularly on the unions. So if you look at some of the first national days of protest, like there was an effort to get trade union speakers, and even before the 2001 election, there were a series of union leaders particularly prepared to speak out and come to those demonstrations. But I think the experience of the 2001 election at the end of that year, and the disgust that a lot of people had with the Labor leadership's Me Tooism, if you like, around refugees, with how it became a much, much bigger issue in the unions and in the Labor Party. So, I mean, even at that election, you could see, that there were a lot of Labor members even that voted for the Greens over refugees at that election. And there was the growth of the emergence of Labor for Refugees, which would really only have been 6 months before the Woomera protest happened, of people in the Labor Party actually trying to agitate and change Labor Party policy to overturn that Me Tooism and support for what the Liberals were doing. And in terms of why I think that that whole issue and what's happening in the Labor Party and the unions was important, I think firstly in terms of Labor, there's always been a need to break that kind of bipartisan political consensus around the Fortress Australia policies and offshore detention and so on. Like, if there's actually going to be an end to those policies, one of the major parties has to break with their support from them. And if you look at the Labor Party, the left obviously has a lot more levers to try and pressure and shift Labor, compared to the Liberals. So it was indicated by the number of unions who were prepared to come out and support refugees, the number of union leaders, particularly after 2001, and the election, who could see what Howard was doing with the racism and the way in which a section of their own union members even were sympathetic, or some voted for the Liberals over that issue, and the need to actually combat that racism that was kind of gaining a hold in the working class. But in terms of the Labor Party particularly, I think there is firstly that issue of Labor members and unions being levers to help to shift the Labor leadership and break Labor's bipartisan support for the anti-refugee politics. Like, if we could actually achieve that even partially, the more there actually are Labor MPs or figures inside the Labor Party prepared to actually speak at pro-refugee demonstrations and put their name to calls to actually change Labor's policy, that actually strengthens the broader movement. It actually helps to shift opinion in society as a whole, because the arguments of the refugee movement are then seen as more legitimate. So all that, I think, helps in terms of the movement's general aims to actually change government policy over refugees and end the demonisation and punishment of refugees. But I also think in terms of the Labor Party itself, the more that there actually is a fight in the Labor Party against the Labor Party leadership by the membership, like that is a good thing for both the refugee movement, and the wider left, because it creates there is a division there between, Labor Party members and the leadership. Like ordinary Labor Party members are not, tied into Parliament and the bureaucracy in the same way that all the MPs are. And the more that we can actually encourage a fight inside the Labor Party, it means that there is a bigger audience for, left-wing and socialist ideas of people who actually want to challenge what the Labor leadership is doing. And that's an audience of people that can also be encouraged to join pro-refugee demonstrations and see the fight as not simply one that's, inside the structures of the Labor Party itself, but is a broader, fight in society at large. And, that means that there's an opportunity to win those people to actually supporting the wider refugee movement and, strengthening the demonstrations and the broader left as a whole, and hopefully shifting sections of the Labor Party membership to the left out of the process.
It's 20 years since the breakout and since the fences were pulled down, which is quite a long while, although I suspect you're still getting some of the red dust out of your sleeping bag. That stuff really sticks around. What lessons would you draw from Woomera for the movement today? We're in a different circumstance. There are refugees right in our major cities, not out in the desert, but we have a government at the moment, the Liberal government, which is arguably even more racist than the Howard government was back in 2002. So what lessons would you draw?
I think one important lesson is simply about the general power of protest to actually win change. So the Woomera protest was like an important moment in the wider refugee movement under the Howard government, which I think a lot of people forget now actually did win important gains. So, for instance, the Howard government itself actually was forced to, a couple of years later, release a lot of the long-term detainees who, still were in detention centres. They got children out of detention. A lot of the people actually were brought off Nauru who were, still languishing in detention on Nauru at the time. Manus Island, was also closed, and the last of the refugees brought off Manus Island. And that was all a product of the movement and the protests and all the organising that people did, of which Woomera was, one important part. So I think, it can seem like a very uphill battle today, and like we've been fighting this battle for 20 years, but it hasn't simply all been one way. I think it's important to see how the growth of the movement under the Howard government actually did shift public opinion significantly. So, there was a big turnaround from 2001 and the time of the Tampa, where there was 70% or so support from the general public for Howard turning around the boat. By the time of 2004, 2005, there was actually a majority of people supporting, the idea that refugee boats should be allowed to land and people seek asylum in Australia. So there were significant, gains out of what the movement did. But I also think Woomera in particular, I think is a very good example of how, direct action or civil disobedience in the right circumstances can actually take forward a campaign and play a part in helping to shift public opinion and the kind of debate in society. So yeah, as I said, the fact that activists were prepared to put themselves on the line and take, effectively illegal action, and helping refugees to break out of detention and directly defy, that detention policy, really raised the stakes in terms of what the movement was doing and prepared to do. And I think that did, spur a lot of debate, across society. And I think that was the fact that it was overwhelmingly positively received and played that positive role, I think, is indicated by the fact at the time that even John Howard didn't feel like he could come out and stridently attack the Woomera protest. He had to actually come out and say that, he thought that the activists had done their cause a disservice, as though somehow he actually cared about the cause that people were protesting for in the first place against his own government. So I think, it was a very good example about the role that kind of radical direct action can play as part of a broader social movement that kind of existed at the time. along with, the mass demonstrations and work in the trade unions and so on. But yeah, was part of that whole process of actually trying to shift government policy over refugees and end the detention of people. I think that was symbolised by the fact that there actually were refugees who broke out of that detention centre during that protest in 2002, who, like a number of them who sort of stayed underground for a few years in Australia and in the end actually did end up being allowed to stay here. There was a process where, in the end, there was backroom kind of discussions with people in the government, and they agreed to allow, in return for doing a short stint in detention again, to give those people the right to actually have a permanent visa and to live here in Australia. And there are still people, today, refugees living their lives in Australia who were part of that breakout in 2002 who won their freedom as a result. So I think there's a lot of things that we can see that were directly achieved out of that protest.
All right, I think that's a really fantastic note to leave it on. Thank you for your time today.
No worries. Thanks, David.